Well, it must be Animal Month. Last time we built a couple birdhouses. This time we're going to build a doghouse. I guess that just goes to show that everybody needs a place to lay their head, even birds and dogs. Well, that's why we're going to build this doghouse for my mother-in-law's pooch. See, we're renovating her backyard, and one of the things we're doing is we're fencing off an area for her pug so she has a place to call her own. And no designated dog area is complete without having, well, you guessed it, a doghouse. So if you're interested in the details of this doghouse, I have a page on my website that you're welcome to go to. Links in the description. There you're going to find a list of tools and materials that I've used in this project, as well as a free set of plans that you can use for your own. And if you do build one for yourself, I would love to see what you guys come up with. Send me your pics, and if you like, I would post it on our project page. Stick around to the end of the video. I'm going to discuss some things that I might have done differently had I done this project again, as well as some things that I really like about this particular design. So let's stop talking and go cut some wood.
With the first sheet of plywood set up on my sawhorses, I used my edge guide and circular saw to cut out the two roof halves and the floorboard. I typically like to break down big 4x8 sheets this way. I measure my cut on both sides of the sheet, line up my edge guide to those marks, clamp it down, and run the saw along the guide to get a nice and straight, clean cut. I cut the floorboard from the opposite end of the sheet, relying on the manufacturer for a square cut. Rails for the bottom of the doghouse are cut out of some pressure-treated 2x4s. When cutting wood, you should always wear some protection for your lungs. That's even more true when cutting pressure-treated wood. Not only do you kick up sawdust, but also the chemical preservatives that are injected into the wood. "4 feet for the rails, I fasten them together using 3-inch exterior wood screws. Finally, I applied some Loctite 2-in-1 Seal and Bond construction adhesive to the rails. Using my combination square, I found my mounting position and secured the rails to the floorboard using 2-inch number 10 SPAC screws. My plywood was a bit warped here, so I used a quick clamp to hold the pieces in place while I screwed them together. I think I went a bit screw crazy here. You could probably save yourself a few. I think I just got a little carried away under that 20-volt power. We get two main pieces from the second piece of plywood, the right and left wall. Here's a better view of how I use my edge guide with the circular saw. I measure and mark my desired width on one side of the plywood, then do the same on the other side. Now I line up my edge guide right up against my marks. I always put the edge guide over the piece I want to cut out. If you do this, you don't need to worry about the measuring for the kerf of the blade. If I were to put the edge guide over the offcut, I would need to adjust the edge guide by the width of my blade. I've marked out the window in one of the walls. First, I drill a hole in the corner large enough to fit the jigsaw blade. I ended up having a bit of an issue with this process though. I tried to use a board as an edge guide, and my newer jigsaw had a loose base on it. As a result, I didn't get the cleanest cuts here. In the end, I just pulled out my trusty old Black & Decker and got the job done. However, my idea of using an edge guide was a flop. Here I made a plunge cut using my circular saw and my edge guide. I wanted to get the cleanest lines possible, and this just seems like a good idea to me. You could just as easily use the jigsaw. In fact, it would have probably saved you a few minutes just to do it in the jigsaw in the first place. With all the major pieces cut out for the carcass, I ripped 9 2-inch strips and 2 1.5-inch strips of 3/4 ply for the trim pieces. I set the tilt on my circular saw to 24 degrees and lined up the blade with the edge of one of the wall pieces. I then marked where the edge of my circular saw rests. I measured from the edge of the board to that mark and made another mark on the other side of the wall. With these marks, I can line up my edge guide and clamp it down. Now, instead of running the saw on top of the edge guide, I run it along the base of it. This gets me a perfect 24-degree cut at the roof side of the wall without sacrificing overall length. Now that I verified that my cut is accurate, I can continue on with the other wall as well as the roof halves. Oh, I almost forgot the window awning. We got to cut that guy too. And I'm not really sure why I decided to use the table saw to cut the other side of the window awning, but I did. So, yeah. Now with everything but the trim cut out, we could now use this time to paint the bottom of the base, because once it's assembled, it'll be much harder to get to. I am using an exterior gloss paint for the carcass and the trim. Exterior paint here is not necessary, considering that I'm going to be finishing it up with spar varnish, and I suggest you do as well. It'll aid in our attempt to preserve our project when it's out in the elements. I admittedly forgot to cut these cross beams in the beginning because I didn't have enough pressure treated wood to cut all the pieces. So here I am cutting some scrap 2x4 to complete the parts. I started with the back wall, and as a helping hand, I employed my corner clamp to hold them together and somewhat square as I screw them together. It worked out rather well and gave me a square wall to start from. Cheese! You might find some boards that are somewhat warped. You may have to muscle things in place to get them as they should be. Wood filler is much more expensive than Bondo, and since this project will be painted, wood filler would be a waste. That's why I like to lean against Bondo to fill the big imperfections that CD grade plywood inevitably has. Once the Bondo is cured, you can go after it with some sandpaper to smooth things out. Once you're happy with the results, you clean up a bit and start painting. I cut a 2x4 to length and then ripped it in half to serve as supports for the roof. These will give me some surface area near the top of the roof line to secure the roof panels. To save some headache and backache, I painted the undersides of the roof panels. I hand planed the roof line just to even out the edges. Using some clear drying quick seal, I sealed the underside of the ceiling. And now we start the trim. I don't have the best miter gauge, so a trick I like to use is to use my speed square to line up my miter gauge up to the saw blade. This works pretty well for 90 and 45 degree crosscuts. For other angled crosscuts, I use the same method just with my angle finder. In applying the trim, I do glue the back sides of the trim, and then I use a brad nailer to keep them in place. These small trim pieces for the patio can be a bit of a pain. I chose to attach these using pocket hole screws. You could just as easily use a brad nailer at an angle, but I think the slight increase in strength a pocket hole screw adds will hopefully keep it intact longer, especially considering dogs are bumping into it carelessly. I used a level here to make sure that the bottom trim piece was parallel with the base trim piece. And the doghouse was slightly off level, so I just made sure that the bubble landed in the same spot. For this decorative truss piece, I marked my 66-degree angles at a width that matches the overall width of my roof line. I added select pine trim pieces to the roof line. At this point, I decided to use better wood than the plywood. My son was eager to learn how to use the brad nailer, so I took it as an opportunity. Unfortunately, it didn't last too long. A quick tip for those of you who are not getting perfect lines from your paint. First, put down your tape, just slightly overlapping your paint line. Then run a razor down the edge and remove any excess tape. Finally, run a small bead of silicone down the edge and rub it down with your finger. Now paint the piece, wait 5 to 10 minutes, and paint on a second coat. Then immediately pull off the tape, being careful not to disturb the wet paint. I have tried this where I put the silicone bead down first and then put the tape on. The results of both of these methods are beautiful. However, I did get better lines when I put down the silicone after the tape. With the new paint roller in hand, I pre-soaked it in mineral spirits just to prime the brush a bit. I then got to work spreading on the spar varnish. If you're not familiar with spar varnish, basically, spar varnish contains resins more suited for rough outdoor situations. They also usually contain some UV inhibitors. Basically, it adds one more layer of protection to help your project last as long as possible. The particular spar varnish I'm using here is Varathane Semi-Gloss Spar Varnish. The can says clear, but it does have somewhat of an amber hue to it. Finally, I cut some anti-fatigue foam mat in a rectangle in just the shape that fits inside the doghouse. This will give her a nice bed to lay on rather than hardwood.
Well, it was a fun project, but now it's over. We got our doghouse complete, and overall, I think it was a fun project. We built it out of 3/4 inch CDX grade plywood. If I were to do it over again, I would probably up the grade to AB. I wouldn't go all the way up to cabinet grade or anything like that. That would just be kind of an overkill for a project that's going to be peed on, chewed on, who knows what else on. This is going to get a lot more wear and tear than any other project you are going to build, hopefully. My second thought that I would do differently would be for the trim. Instead of doing the 3/4 inch ply, again, I would upgrade for that to be either select pine, cedar, poplar, or cabinet grade plywood. So I would stick with the cheaper wood, but CDX is a little bit too cheap. There's the knots are too big, there's too many imperfections on the surface, and there's a ton of voids. So it's hard to get the trim pieces to look good. Another thing I would have done differently is before I attached any of the trim, I should have painted it all. The reason being is there's a lot of areas on here that's hard to get to. Do yourself a favor, paint the trim before you put it on. Let's go over to the positive side. Some of the things that I really like about this design is, first, the way I designed it is to have the most appeal to the front left of the doghouse. And the reason I did that is that's going to be the angle at which most people see it. It's going to sit in a corner at a 45-degree angle, and most people are going to be where you're at right now. The other thing is the way the trim is lipped over, and that kind of just helps with a few bugs from getting on there. That's about it about this thing. I really enjoyed this project. Again, if you're building one on your own, please send me pics and I'd be glad to post it on our project page. Now, if you like this video, hit the like button, please, and stick around because the next video, I'm going to show you how I made this sign. Please subscribe.